on Nelson Mandela International Day. On this occasion, we take a moment to reflect upon the timeless wisdom and extraordinary legacy of Nelson Mandela, a towering figure who embodied the very essence of human rights, equality, and justice. All on this day, people are giving selflessly 67 minutes to their communities. This year, they do so under the Nelson Mandela International Day 2023 theme, quote unquote, climate, food, and solidarity. His life's journey and dedication to the service of humanity intersected profoundly with the principles enshrined in the UDHR and BBPOA, inspiring generations and serving as a testament to the triumph of the human spirit. President Mandela's unwavering devotion to the principle of non-discrimination resonates deeply with the core values of the UDHR and BBP. His vision encompassed a world where every individual, regardless of their race, gender, or social background, would be embraced and accorded the respect and dignity they deserve. Like most of you participating in this year's finals of the Nelson Mandela Moot Court, President Mandela also studied law, during which time his activism grew stronger in the fight against injustice. President Mandela's pivotal role in the fight against apartheid in South Africa showcased his unwavering commitment to justice, equality, and human rights for all. He stood firm in his belief that the oppressor and the oppressed would be reconciled through dialogue and understanding, leading to the eventual dismantling of apartheid and the establishment of a democratic order in South Africa. This demonstrated the power of peace and non-violence in bringing about lasting change. Young people like you who are present here today hold the key to continuing Mandela's legacy and advancing the cause of human rights worldwide. Your engagement in this competition reflects your dedication to upholding justice, defending the vulnerable, and safeguarding human dignity. As young people, you should be emboldened by his words, and I quote, "There is no passion to be found playing small in settling for a life that is less than the one that you are capable of leading." Close quote. Let's aspire to greatness, inspire change, and tirelessly champion a world where the rights and dignity of every individual are respected and safeguarded. As we commemorate his legacy, it is crucial to recognize the significance of events such as this Moot Court competition in fostering the next generation of human rights defenders. Remember, President Mandela was not just a freedom fighter. He was a champion of human rights. His vision extended beyond South Africa, advocating for human rights across the globe, touching the lives of countless individuals facing oppression and discrimination. You, the young advocates of today, you have the power to carry his legacy forward. You are indeed the custodians of the Madiba legacy. While you debate this week in the halls of the Human Rights Council, make sure that your arguments are inspired by the UDHR and the VDPA, as well as the spirit of Nelson Mandela. And indeed, in your debates, do echo the clarion call the world to rededicate itself to the promotion and protection of human rights everywhere. As you passionately argue for human rights during this competition, remember the instructive wisdom of President Nelson Mandela himself, where he said, "To be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others. Your advocacy, your dedication, and your determination can create ripples of change that will impact lives beyond this competition. In conclusion, I encourage each one of you to embrace the spirit of President Nelson Mandela, a spirit that defied all odds, fought for justice, and cherished the universal values of human rights. Let his memory be a driving force as you strive to become advocates for positive change, not just within your communities, but globally. Be the change. Be agents of change. Thank you very much for joining us in this celebration of the great icon of human rights, of justice, of equality, of fairness, of the restoration of human dignity. And I wish you all the best in the Nelson Mandela World Human Rights Moot Court competition. May your efforts in defending human rights indeed continue to sustain his enduring legacy. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. I often forget when in Geneva that it is very important to observe certain protocols. And so I must ask for forgiveness. I would like to acknowledge Ms. Gillian Triggs, who is here with us this evening, right here in front. Ms. Triggs is the Assistant High Commissioner for Protection of the UN High Commission for Refugees, and who will be a panelist in our lecture this evening, immediately after the welcome ceremony. And with that, I would like to call Mr. Eric Tistelay for his welcome. Dear Program Director, dear President of the Human Rights Council, dear Ambassador Dikosi from the Permanent Representative of South African, dear Assistant High Commissioner for Protection, and of course, dear participants and dear students. I wish you all a very warm welcome on behalf of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, and I wish to congratulate you for participating in this prestigious event. It is wonderful to see so many students and professors from around the globe, and I'm very pleased to congratulate all of you upon your qualification to the final rounds of the Moot Court competition. I know that this was not very easy for you to complete the stages, so congratulations. Your diverse backgrounds and experience will undoubtedly yield a rich, colorful, and comprehensive debate, and provide for an unforgettable encounter through sharing culture, knowledge, skills, and your own experiences. As you proudly represent your academic institutions, you also represent many universities, and if I'm correct, 23, from 90 countries covering all regions of the world. And in addition, it is also important to acknowledge the participation of academics and judges from not less than 20 countries. And in fact, what we are seeing here is a mini United Nations. This event, which we are opening today, is not only significant as it provides an opportunity to interact freely and creatively on issues dear to you with peers from other locations, but also as it provides an important stepping stone to what I'm sure will lead to prosperous careers. Upon completing your studies, I'm very confident you will make positive contributions to promoting and protecting human rights in your own countries and well beyond. But, and that is a question I'm asking you myself tonight, what does it mean to make a positive contribution to promoting and protecting human rights? It means being a courageous and effective advocate for the rights of others, who often face great risk in areas where basic human rights are still ignored. It means working to inspire others to speak out on critical thematic issues which may not get the attention they deserve. It means working collectively to encourage decision makers to make the right choice for the benefits of human rights victims. It means remaining faithful throughout a lengthy and hopefully prosperous period to the choice made on the university benches. The hypothetical case before you is an extremely interesting one. I tried to read it. It's very well drafted, and I'm sorry to say, a very complex one. It addresses numerous human rights issues and challenges, and they are in fact critical issues which we address on a daily basis at the office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, of course, at the High Commissioner for Refugees on numerous levels. They are debated at length by the Human Rights Council, particularly when special rapporteurs or commissions of inquiry and other investigative bodies are presenting their reports and entering into interactive dialogue with a representative of the international community. They are also being considered by treaty bodies when reviewing state reports, communications, or discussing general comment. This is nothing new for all of you. In this regard, I would like, and I should not fail to pay tribute to Christoph Heinz, former special rapporteur and human rights committee members who never refrain from placing complex and delicate issues to the scrutiny of the council, and whose active presence and friendship we are all missing so much. Since yesterday, you started debating these very complex issues. In a past setting, you have been asked to represent either a state or a complainant, and this in itself is a great venture. It allows you to grasp the full complexity of a word, which is increasingly hard to understand, to grasp, and to analyze. It shows you that the complexity of the human rights architecture equals that of the word itself. We are very often being told that the work which is done in UN rooms, particularly that of the Human Rights Council, is politicized. But this is unfortunately a very surreal statement, at least to me, since by definition, human rights are of a political nature, as Aristotle would have said it. What is important is to understand the polarization which currently exists and see what can be done to overcome it. And on this account, the Moot Court is a good place to start pondering about this matter by acknowledging that everything we are doing is of a complex nature and cannot be divided in a dogmatic and binary nature between good and evil. The word and the issues we are considering are far more nuanced. If you allow me this aphorism, they are made of numerous colors, which we need to be able to keep alive at the same time. At the end of the day, one needs to be able to consider all of them in very global. To be more concrete and speaking to you, dear students, allow me to say this to all of you. You must never lose sight that the matters which you are advocating this week are all real issues. Real issues that affect too many people in too many places in the world. Therefore, your endeavor this week and much beyond will be a noble and ambitious one. While debating these issues in search of lasting solutions, let me ask you to be constantly mindful of those you aim to serve, the human rights victims. Far too often, while working days and weeks and months on files and cases, even the most devoted human rights officers, diplomats, activists may start losing this crucial perspective. In a way, there is an inherent tendency to focus on the word rights instead of the word human in human rights. What I would like you to remind is all about this word human, which needs to be at the core of your thinking when dealing with cases of this nature. Speaking as someone who has worked for quite some time on human rights issues in various sittings, I can assure you it is easy to become distracted from the very aim of this work. Otherwise put, to lose sight of the purpose of your actions today and tomorrow, in whichever field of activities you will embrace, is to improve the lives of those on the ground. The general concept of human rights is an abstract one. When one debates human rights in setting far removed from those where the issues being discussed occur, it is very easy to become cynical, discouraged, or even doubtful of the purpose of the debate. So, when discussing this very case in the next few days, visualize the face of victims. Don't reduce them to an hypothetical case. Raise them to that of those you will serve today and hopefully tomorrow. In time, you will join the community of those struggling to ensure that human rights are a reality for all, as an NGO activist, a representative of a member state, a researcher, a staff member, a national human rights institution officer, or an international civil servant. Perhaps one day you will find yourself sitting in room 20 at the Palais des Nations in Geneva, where our council meets under this beautiful sitting by Michael Barcello. You will face hours and hours of difficult negotiations, hard discussions, early and late meetings. You will work around the clock and you will have to compromise to get your points advanced or your ideas upheld. On this occasion, when you will sit underneath this work of art, your human rights responsibility will be to remember the faces of the faceless and the unknown, the anonymous human rights victims, the imperious nature of human rights standards, as well as the need to move forward the human rights agenda, whatever the circumstances. So, dear students, one could argue that when the social media hits the world stage, incidentally around more or less around the same time as the creation of the Human Rights Council, the face of human rights itself has changed. Why, with the emergence of social media tools, human rights activists and messages took on a new form, as has been evidenced on numerous occasions in various locations. Millions are watching every day the Human Rights Council proceeding on their screens far away from Geneva. Despite the universal mission, the United Nations cannot be in all places at the same time. It cannot provide a solution to every challenge. That is why we depend on diplomats, on civil society, on media, teachers, and on you, dear students, soon to be legal practitioners, to help spread the word about human rights in order to clarify the meaning, to share the implementation and rectify any misunderstanding or misperception. Together we can and should work out more effective ways to set a global agenda and consensus. We can and should be visionary and proactive. To do this, we need dialogue, patience, resilience, and a variety of ways and means, and varieties of ways and places to spread this fundamental principle that we do have all the same rights, whoever we are and whether we are and whether we are. It's not always easy to trace the transformation of abstract messages and legal language delivered at human rights forums, house, or schoolrooms into concrete positive changes that affects real people elsewhere in the society. And it is reassuring to acknowledge the tremendous potential that we have thanks to the action and dedication of individuals and groups such as all of you sitting here in front of me today. We have plenty of proof that human rights concept can and must be translated into action. But first, we must educate, inspire, and empower, and this competition complements this lofty goal. And at this stage, I should turn to the organizer, whom the office has supported from the very beginning, and thank them very warmly for this initiative and dedication to this noble cause. It is indeed of importance to acknowledge the role which is the Center and the University of Pretoria have played and continue to play in shaping the agenda of the national and international human rights system. In conclusion, many years ago, I had that immense honor and privilege of meeting President Mandela when I was still at the very early stage of my career in the United Nations. This was in connection with the preparation of the Durban Conference. During a visit of the High Commissioner Mary Robinson, I was her assistant. As many will attest, when you have the rare opportunity and privilege to meet a person of such greatness, even for a few minutes, and as an anonymous assistant of the then High Commissioner Robinson, you tend to lose yourself and your words. And to be honest, I don't even recall what I said on this occasion. I'm not even sure I said anything. But what I can say is that I do recall his kindness, but his wisdom and his humanity and the richness of the experience he shared with the High Commission during that meeting. I was honored to attend and observe. I will never, ever forget the lasting impression it left on me, especially since my student thesis was decades ago on the legal value of the UN sanctions against the apartheid regime. And the lasting impression by President Mandela helped fuel me and define my own career as a human rights officer. So I thank him. In concluding my remarks, let me read the last paragraph from A Long Walk to Freedom. And I quote, "I walked that long road to freedom. I've tried not to falter. I've made missteps along the way. But I have discovered the secret that after climbing a great hill, one may find that there are many noble hills to climb. I've taken a moment here to rest, to steal a view of the glorious vista that surrounds me, to look back on the distance I have come, but I can rest only for a moment. For this freedom comes responsibilities, and I dare not linger, for my long walk is not yet ended. End of quotation. Nelson Mandela's walk ended a decade ago, and it is now up to your generation, dear students, your generation to follow his steps. I'm very confident your experience during this Moot competition will leave a lasting impression and joyful memories with you for years to come, and that you will prove to be the human rights leaders of the generation to come. I wish you the very best of luck, and I thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tissanay, for those words. I think we're actually almost on time. We will take a very brief 2-minute intermission before we move into the second part of this event, which is the lecture. But before we do that, I would like to thank very much Ambassador Bala for your remarks, Ambassador Nkosi for your remarks, and Mr. Tissanay for your remarks on the occasion of the Mandela competition. So thank you very much. So I also now see that the permanent representative of Samoa is arrived, and Ambassador will also be a panelist the lecture this evening. And so perhaps I will ask Ambassador Bala, Mr. Tissanay. Thank you very much. Ambassador Nkosi has graciously agreed to welcome our lecturer or panelists for the lecture. So he will remain here. And I kindly ask Ms. Strix to take a seat in front, if you may. And Ambassador, if you're as well, if you can kindly join us here in the front. And so thank you so much. So the topic of this evening's lecture is on the 1951 Refugee Convention. And I think that it is a topic which has been discussed very broadly within the hypothetical case. It's also a topic which is very topical within our current reality. And we really have amazing and wonderful experts here today who will expand this discussion. We will also place forward their views and their thoughts on where we are, what are the challenges the refugees face in their various forms, what should we do as we look forward, and what steps can we take today, even as small as possible, to make that reality possible. And so we're going to break the evening into 2 parts. The first one is Ambassador Nkosi, who will very graciously introduce the topic and also our 2 panelists. And Dr. Patrick Ebba will then moderate this discussion. And after that, of course, we will have a question and answer sessions, which you are also very welcome to engage and to ask whatever it is that you think is important, and perhaps your thoughts as well on the issue. And so with that, Ambassador Nkosi, I leave it to you.
Well, thanks very much, Program Director. Thought you've seen the last of the my young banks. You should be disappointed. I'm here again. Well, I'm extremely honored to make a few remarks on the occasion of the fourth annual Nelson Mandela Human Rights Lecture. This lecture, indeed, the panel with the very distinguished panelists will serve as a platform to address one of the most pressing challenges of our time, as the program director indicated, the plight of the forcibly displaced individuals worldwide. The staggering figures from the Global Trends report released by the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights highlight the gravity of the situation we face. At the end of 2022, 108 million people were forcibly displaced from their homes due to persecution, conflict, violence, human rights violations, and other catastrophic events. This unprecedented increase of 19 billion from the previous year reflects the largest annual jump ever, affecting more than 1 in every 74 people on our planet. In a world rapidly shaped by a multitude of factors, including wars, pandemics, climate change, technological advancements, and socio-economic shocks, the existing normative framework for the protection of refugees, established through the 1951 Refugee Convention and its 1967 protocol, indeed faces new challenges and complexities. The panelists assembled for this lecture will focus on evaluating the adequacy of the 1951 Refugee Convention and the broader international refugee regime in addressing the needs of those displaced in this ever-changing global context. This includes examining the impact of climate change, conflicts, and the other 21st century phenomena on refugee protection. It is indeed imperative that we increase awareness of the relevance of existing instruments in safeguarding displaced individuals amidst this evolving landscape. Our goal is to assess the strengths and shortcomings of the current framework, identify potential offsets, proposing viable solutions to protect asylum seekers and refugees effectively. As we strive to honor Nelson Mandela and his legacy, we recognize that refugee protection remains a crucial and urgent matter for those who are forced to flee their homelands. In this regard, we aim to foster constructive dialogue and cooperation among professionals, researchers, policymakers, NGOs, affected individuals, and all stakeholders invested in refugee protection. Let me just pause and check with the program director. It seems that I am giving you palpitations, so I'll continue with the script, please. Yes. Now, the hybrid format of this lecture, with participants joining from Geneva and virtual, reflects our commitment to inclusivity and global engagement. Together, we delve into the complexities of refugee protection in an age of change and global complexity. I take this opportunity to express our sincere gratitude to the distinguished panelists who have joined us, and I'm happy to see Honorable Gillian Twiggs, with whom I engage regularly here in Geneva on a wide range of issues pertaining to the protection of the refugees, particularly, as you know, South Africa is one of the countries that receives quite a large stream of refugees and we engage with the Assistant High Commissioner for Protection on these matters, but not exclusively on matters pertaining to refugees in South Africa, but matters pertaining to refugees also to the SADC region, as well as throughout. But Africa, by the way, hosts the largest numbers of refugees as a continent in a number of countries. And indeed, the biggest challenge around refugee protection is on the African continent. The Assistant High Commissioner, as you know, serves as the Assistant High Commissioner for Protection. And as you know, she has been appointed by the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, to serve in this capacity. The High Commissioner, the Assistant High Commissioner, previously served a 5-year term as President of the Australian Human Rights Commission, and she brought into this position several decades of professional experience as an academic, practicing lawyer, advocate, and public policy expert. An expert in international law, she has extensive history of dedicated service to human rights and refugee causes in Australia, in the Asia-Pacific region, and globally. So welcome the Assistant High Commissioner. You can give a round of applause. Next to the Assistant High Commissioner is my dear sister and friend, the distinguished ambassador of the Republic of Samoa, the permanent representative of the Republic of Samoa to the United Nations Office in Geneva. I had the honor of serving with her in Brussels a decade ago. So we're together in Brussels, advancing the interests of the global south on a wide range of issues, including issues of climate change. And as you know, these days, the refugee movement is induced not only by conflict and economic situation, but it's also induced by climate. So I'm happy to have my dear sister Nella from Samoa here. She was previously counselor at the Embassy of Samoa in Brussels. And she has served as principal foreign service officer, as well as the senior foreign service officer in the foreign ministry of Samoa. A seasoned career diplomat who has now been catapulted to the position of the permanent representative of the Fraternal Republic of Samoa here in Geneva. This lecture will be moderated by Dr. Patrick Eva, Deputy Director, Policy and Law Division of International Protection, Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. So a round of applause for Justice. A round of applause for our moderator. In closing, let us remember that Nelson Mandela's unwavering dedication to human rights serves as a guiding light, inspiring us to forge a path towards a more just and compassionate world. As we engage in this critical conversation this evening, let us renew our commitment to uphold the values of dignity, compassion, and solidarity, working together to protect and support those in need. I now hand over to the moderator to conduct its evening's much anticipated session. We wish everybody very rich, very lively, very illuminating discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Nkosi. Thank you very much, Ambassador Nkosi, and also for your very gracious introduction of our panelists tonight. And without further ado, I would like to invite Madam Gillian Triggs, the Assistant High Commissioner for Protection of UNHCR, to kindly make a remark on the issues that we will be listening today around the challenges to the global refugee regime. So, Madam Triggs, you are.
Thank you, Ambassador. Very much.
All the best. Thank you.
I was going to say, Your Excellencies, but we have very good to see you. And thank you very much, all of you, distinguished guests, my colleagues who are here, and of course to the wonderful students who have survived, I imagine, a fairly rigorous selection process to come here to Geneva to compete. So I'm really delighted that you're here. The future of international law lies with you. And I think it's very important that we have this remarkable lecture annually and a competition. I can think of no better way of understanding refugee law and honing your skills as advocates than a moot court. In my former life, I was an academic, and we were involved in a number of international moot courts, and they really are a great privilege to be part of. And those that you compete against will probably be your friends for the rest of your life. Wherever you are, you'll always remember the Nelson Mandela Human Rights Lecture. So I'm really, really pleased to be with you and to have an opportunity to talk about refugee law. Thinking of what I was going to say today, I was quite interested initially in finding out what the connection is between UNHCR and Nelson Mandela. And with the support of my colleagues, we managed through our archive to find a really fascinating historical record of the role that the United Nations Refugee Agency played at the end of apartheid in repatriating 15,000 South African refugees back home to South Africa and assisting them, of course, while they were in exile, where it was impossible for them to return home. And it was rather wonderful that our archivists managed to find a letter from Nelson Mandela to our then High Commissioner for Refugees, Madam Ogata from Japan. When she retired, he thanked her in the most moving of letters for her work in protecting South African refugees while in exile and, of course, in facilitating their return back home. And I thought it was just a wonderful example of how the Refugee Agency can work and how important it is in very particular refugee situations. Of course, many of us, when we talk about Nelson Mandela, go back to his wonderful quotes, and many of them, of course, deal with freedom for a very obvious reason. But he also understood the underlying forces that are so critical to understanding the plight of refugees. Because he said, so long as poverty, injustice, and gross inequality persist, none of us can truly rest. And I think that's true. And I very much admire and appreciate the comments of our earlier speakers in really emphasizing the importance of the fundamental principles of refugee law in moving towards understanding the plight of refugees and the very special legal position they have under international law. So I haven't read the problem, although I gather my colleagues have helped draft it. I haven't read it, so I'm not prejudiced at all, but I hope that it mislead you in terms of what you're about to be debating over the next few days. But of course, the point has been well made, and one that I really do need to repeat, that we are facing unprecedented challenges globally for the plight of people displaced for one reason or another. And perhaps I would remind you that the Refugee Convention in 1951 was negotiated, of course, 5 years after the end of the Second World War. And the aim was to find a solution, a durable solution for people displaced as a consequence of the Second World War, particularly of persecution. But the numbers, but perhaps, I don't know who that was, that was me, I think.
That's the apologies.
Right. But the point I wanted to make is that when this agreement was negotiated by 26 foundation countries, the number they were dealing with at that time was about 2 million people within Europe. Today, we are dealing with a totally different environment. And that is one reported by our High Commissioner, and the number's been repeated, 108 million, at least at the end of last year. The numbers have continued to rise since then. We know them to be well over 110 million. It's extraordinary, but year after year, for the last 10 years, we've repeated increased numbers of people forcibly displaced. And we are now dealing this year with a record-breaking 19 million people additionally increased in those forcibly displaced. Over the last year, we've declared, and this is part of UNHCR procedures, we've declared 35 new global emergencies. We could not have imagined anything so dramatic globally in terms of the displacement. And 2/3 of those people displaced, you will not be at all surprised to know, come from Afghanistan, from Syria, from Ukraine, and Venezuela. And the recent conflict that I think has shocked us all, not only, of course, the Ukraine war itself, but the recent conflict in Sudan, where the civilian population has fled. We think about 800,000 Sudanese refugees are now seeking protection across national borders in surrounding countries. Over 3.5 million are displaced within Sudan itself, joining the already 1.1 million in the country who were hosted by, of course, a country that itself has its economic and political problems. But of course, in addition to armed conflict, and we know that conflict is the primary driver of these massive numbers of people displaced either internally or about 36 million displaced across boundaries, there are also other elements, social economic conditions, environmental degradation and climate change, and I hope we're going to talk about that a little bit later. Of course, the global pandemic, inflation, partly as a consequence of the Ukraine war, natural disasters, the horrific earthquake in northwest Syria and of course in Turkey, and the impact indeed of social media, hate speech, and the impact of new technologies, all in their various ways have multiplier effects as drivers of displacement. And in recognizing those displacements, we also need to understand that a major root cause lies in breaches of the very human rights that Nelson Mandela stood up for and understood so brilliantly, and so in such devastating ways. But also, of course, those rights that were reflected and have been in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1958. And I don't really need to repeat them, but I will briefly. The right to equality, to life, liberty and security, to protection from discrimination and arbitrary arrest or detention, the right to education, to access to work, to freedom of movement, critically important, and to nationality. And to respect those human rights is to address the root causes of refugee flight in the spirit of leaving no one behind, the phrase that the Secretary General is asking us to think about when we think about the importance of managing the many challenges that we have to face in the global environment. So the question that we all have to ask as lawyers, as international lawyers, is given this rise of emergencies, of displacements globally, the movement of people seeking international protection, what is the role that international law can play? Can it play any significant role at all? It may have worked for 2 million people in 1951. It may have been relevant and deeply supported by the negotiating states. But what about today? And I suspect that that's one of the questions you're going to be looking at when you deal with the questions that I haven't seen. But of course, it is the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that has two absolutely crucial provisions. One is the right to seek and enjoy asylum from persecution under Article 14, and the right to a nationality under Article 15. And then we've seen, of course, the Refugee Convention itself building on the Universal Declaration, which was, of course, revolutionary for its time. If you think back, it guaranteed refugees the widest possible exercise of fundamental rights and freedoms, but added, and this was perhaps the revolutionary part, economic, social, and cultural rights to the relatively well understood civil and political rights. And I'd like to suggest to you today that the 1951 Convention does remain a viable and relatively effective framework for the international protection of refugees. But there are many challenges by those who argue that the Refugee Convention is no longer fit for purpose and that it needs reform. And I'll leave you to think about whether that is right. But what I'd like to do in a very brief time is to look at some of the challenges to making that international law work. And one is to look at the primary purpose of the UN Refugee Agency, which is to find durable solutions for refugees. Everything we do needs to be thought about in terms of whether we can protect refugees, but ultimately to find a durable solution for them. And we've traditionally looked at certain kinds of solutions. One is a voluntary return to the country of origin. Another is resettlement to a third country. A third is local integration in the host country, typically within the region from which the refugees solutions. Well, that doesn't hurt to be repeated. What I want to say is that the solution of voluntary returns to your country of origin is what every refugee will say they most want. We do return surveys regularly in many of our operations throughout the world. And this is almost invariably the answer, that a refugee does want to return home if it's safe and in legal terms dignified also for them to do so. But the great tragedy that we're facing today is that so many of the conflicts with which we're dealing are protracted conflicts. They're periods of political instability. There are threats from non-government armed groups where governments are not able to protect their own citizens. Of course, nature abhors a vacuum, and quickly non-government armed forces come in. When you're on the move, seeking protection, it's often very difficult to have access to services, to health, to get children into school, to find opportunities to work. One might be subject to conscription, and there may be all sorts of unresolved property and land disputes, to say nothing, of course, of the mining of lands after conflicts are finished. So one of the great problems is that while we hope that people will be able to return, the honest truth is that for many, many of them, they will never return back to their country of origin. I should say more positively that 5.7 million have returned to their place of origin last year, which is an increase on the year before, but nonetheless, the core problem remains. Most refugees remain for many, many years, if not for the rest of their lives, within the country in which they've sought protection. The second solution is resettlement to a safe third country. And resettlement is really the gold standard. If you can be found to be a refugee in need of international protection and you are found to be a person particularly vulnerable, then it may be possible for UNHCR or other entities to refer a resettlement proposal to a third country. That means that a person then has a pathway to citizenship, they have permanent residency, they can work, they can get their children into school, they can get accommodation, they can get access to healthcare. It's a very important solution, but sadly, it's one that provides a solution for a very tiny number of refugees. Probably a resettlement for last year amounted to about 57,000 refugees departing to 20 different new hosting countries. But this will never really resolve the long-term sheer numbers of the people that we're dealing with today. There are other opportunities, and you hear a lot about this in the media: regular and complementary pathways, labour mobility, education, family reunion, and community sponsorship. And we do see real prospects for adding to these regular pathways. A prime minister, a president, a political leader, a minister for migration may say, we will not allow irregular migration, or sometimes say illegal access to a country without a visa, but come by regular pathway. We fully support that. Come with a visa to work. Many countries in the world, particularly in the West, are aging communities. They need labour, they need migration. There are other ways of finding solutions. It can also be achieved through education, through scholarships programs that allow refugee youths to have a better access to quality education. Family reunion is a very significant way of finding a long-term solution, with residence permits passing 1.2 million a year approximately. But there can be impediments. Refugees continue typically to lack travel documents. They flee when their villages are burned, when they are brutally attacked. Of course they flee. They don't have time to find documents, or if they do have documents, they're damaged or out of date. And one of the things that we're thinking about is to look at some form of internationally recognized refugee travel documents that allows them to move in a regular, legal way that will be recognized by countries where they are produced. The Nansen passport that you may have heard of is an idea that's perhaps got a little bit of life. Fridtjof Nansen was appointed the High Commissioner for Refugees to the League of Nations in 1921. And we're now hoping that maybe we can revive that idea to get a new 21st century Nansen passport that would give people some regularity, because lack of documents is a very significant problem. But the third solution, although it's maybe a temporary one, is integration in the local community. Because people will actually spend most of their time, many years, in far too many cases, they will need to be integrated into that community. It can be politically difficult, and it's difficult for that host country, because they have to carry the financial responsibility for people who have come in an emergency. They've kept their borders open, they've allowed them access to make a territorial claim for asylum, but they nonetheless then have to provide accommodation, healthcare, education, and so on. And that's why I suggest that we need some refreshed, creative thinking about how to ensure effective protection. We don't have enough solutions, so we need to find new solutions. One is something I imagine that you've heard about, is the humanitarian development peace nexus. It's been talked about for many years, but what we're starting to work on at UNHCR with greater depth is the ability to encourage development assistance to start to deal with root causes for those countries of origin, and of course the host of countries as well. So we hope that through work with the World Bank, with the regional development banks, it's possible to make a link between a humanitarian and emergency response and development assistance to try to deal with root causes. But one element of that, of a new approach that we're looking at in UNHCR, is a whole of journey approach. Refugees come from long distances to find sanctuary. They might come up through the west coast of Africa to the Canary Islands, Spain. They might come from the Balkans, from Afghanistan, Syria. They might come through Sudan, South Sudan, through Niger, Libya. There are many routes through the Sahel, the Burkina Faso, Mali, and then up through to the Mediterranean in search of safety. Similarly, in the Americas, coming up from Haiti, all the way through Nicaragua, all the way through El Salvador, Guatemala, Mexico, United States, Canada. These are routes where people travel. Some of them migrants, they're mixed movements, some of them migrants, but some of them refugees in need of international protection within the Refugee Convention. And they desperately need support along those routes. So rather than taking dangerous journeys to crossing boundaries, particularly the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, or the Andaman Sea in Asia, that we would be able to support them with childcare, with protection against gender-based violence, counselling, mental health support, accurate advice about what their options are that are available to them as migrants or refugees, maybe labour mobility, maybe even assessment for their refugee legal status to have the rights of a refugee. But there's a lot that can be done, and we are looking at some of those opportunities. So I'd like to now move on very briefly to the question that I believe is going to be part of the problem that you're looking at, which is the impact of climate change. You hear everywhere the phrase, well, they're a climate refugee. Are they a refugee as a matter of law under the Refugee Convention, or is this a convenient statement, a convenient way of describing how it is that somebody has been displaced? And it's a very important legal problem because, as you all know, and we know in this heat at the moment, climate change is affecting all our lives, and it's a matter of global urgency that we find some solutions. We have a drought in Somalia, which in turn has led to conflict, which has in turn led to many thousands of people moving across that border into Ethiopia itself, a country recovering from civil war. We have food insecurity across Africa, global inflation, dwindling economic opportunities. I've mentioned the earthquakes in Syria and Turkey, floods in Pakistan, fires in Canada, and of course the heat waves that we've been experiencing. So the World Bank, in its 2023 World Development Report, estimates that 3.5 billion people live in places vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. Water shortages, drought, sea rise levels, cyclones, fires and floods, all fueling yet further displacement and conflict. So the question then that we're often asked is, do people who have left or left their homes as a consequence of climate change become a refugee? And one way in which we are trying to understand this, because all law moves with the times, to understand how the idea of climate refugee fits within the Refugee Convention itself. And one way in which we are fairly sure ground is to say that where the conflict, where the climate impact has led to conflict, and someone is displaced as a consequence of that conflict related to the elements of the definition of race, nationality, political opinion, and of course membership of a social group, where those elements are present, then it is possible to argue that someone has become a refugee as a climate refugee. Now, that's not something that's yet, we don't have a great deal of legal authority for that, but what is interesting is that as a practical matter, the international community is asking the UN Refugee Agency to support and work with people who've been displaced in these circumstances. So it's a very interesting legal question where we don't yet have definitive legal authority, but we do, as a matter of interpretation of the convention, have a practical response where climate has led to conflict. On other elements, we're going to have to see how the law develops. And it will develop in all the ways that I know you will have studied: the development of customary law, the practice of states, the views of tribunals and judicial bodies, soft law declarations, as well as, of course, any treaty that might be relevant. So these are questions that you're going to have to answer, not only for the Moot over these few days, but longer term. How to understand how international law evolves to respond to these problems. But I'll leave you with one example, that is North Cameroon in 2021. There was intercommunal violence over dwindling water resources. And that led to a further conflict between herders, traditional herders, where the grass was drying out, there wasn't anything left, the fishermen who needed the dwindling the resources, and farmers. This was in the area of Lake Chad. The tributaries started to dry up, and conflict led to the death of hundreds of people, and thousands fled across that river border to neighbouring Chad. Now, you might know that, of course, Chad is now receiving very high numbers of refugees as a consequence of the conflict in Sudan. So one of the concerns we have is the plight of those countries that are continuing to receive, keeping their borders open, allowing access to asylum, but continuing to provide a level of protection for people in the North Cameroon and Chad case, people fleeing indirectly, at least as a consequence of the loss of a water resource. So can I conclude on a much more positive note, and that is to say that building, and this is another important issue for you to think about as international lawyers, building on the Refugee Convention and the suite of international law concerning refugees and human rights generally, we are now in a different era of the Global Compact on Refugees and, of course, the Compact on Migration as well, the two compacts. And that is, these are not legal documents. They are aspirational documents under which the parties to the Compact on Refugees, which I'll stay with, they've agreed two very, very important new ideas. The first is that globally we have a need to share equitably the burden and responsibilities for refugees, to share equitably that burden across the world. But the second point is that burden is not only the burden of the sovereign state that you will be mainly concerned with in looking at international human rights law, but also a responsibility of the whole of society, for cities, local mayors, for faith-based groups, local communities, scholars, along with, of course, governments and international organizations and NGOs. So that is the aspiration. That is what we are trying at the UN Refugee Agency with our many partners, is to try to give effect to an aspiration that's not legal, but is one that most countries in the international community have agreed to, and we know that they strongly support what we're trying to do, and they support those principles. At the end of this year, we have the Global Refugee Forum, and the purpose of that forum is to encourage pledging to support the equitable sharing of burdens and responsibilities. I'm putting that very simply, but I won't go into more detail. But the idea is to show solidarity, and to go back to a practical example, back to North Cameroon and Chad. How does the international community pledge support in real measurable terms to Chad, now supporting many thousands of refugees, the numbers of which continue to rise? And that's the challenge for the future. How to share the burden when most refugees are hosted by poor or low and middle income countries. So it's a significant challenge, but it's one that's why we need a new generation of young lawyers to come through to help resolve these problems, where we build on the complex treaty system, but use different legal or different non-technically legal devices like compacts and declarations and other elements of so-called soft law. I'm sure you know all about that, to find solutions. So thank you very much for the opportunity. And of course, it's a great honor to speak, to celebrate the birthday of Nelson Mandela. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Gillian, for your inspiring, insightful, but also really real life presentation of the continued relevance of the 1951 Geneva Refugee Convention in our tormented world. Thank you also, Gillian, for speaking to the fact that the response to the global refugee problem requires solidarity, responsibility sharing, and the engagement of a new generation of lawyers that we have before us today. So thank you again, Gillian, for your statement, really insightful and inspiring. I would now like to invite our second panelist, Her Excellency Ambassador Nela Pepe Tabita Levy, who, as you all know, is the permanent representative of Samoa to the United Nations here in Geneva. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Good evening. Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting me to speak. Also, please convey my thank you to His Excellency for the kind introductory words for me. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I know it's too late in the afternoon to hear, let alone listen. So I thought I'll provide some background visuals to help you stay awake for the next few minutes, particularly for those who may not be familiar with the Pacific, where I am from. So I think you can let it work as a slideshow, just so that when I'm speaking, you can visualize where I'm from. Can I have a show of hands who's familiar with Samoa, the Pacific, who's been to the Pacific? Oh, wonderful. At the outset, I'm not a lawyer, but I'm very thankful for the opportunity for me to come along and share with you some thoughts on displaced people from the perspective of my country, Samoa, the Pacific region where I am from, and add to the collective voice of small island developing states facing the formidable challenges brought about by climate change. I hope I will be able to shed light on an important aspect of this global crisis, the evolving concept of refugees and its relevance in the context of climate change, particularly for small island developing states. The concept of a refugee, as defined by the 1951 Convention relating to the status of refugees, traditionally refers to individuals who are forced to flee their countries due to persecution, war, or violence, as we heard from Gillian and this afternoon. However, in recent years, the world has witnessed a significant transformation in the causes and consequences of displacement, particularly in the context of climate change. For small island developing states, the impacts of climate change are already a harsh reality. Rising sea levels and extreme weather events threaten our very existence. We are not only grappling with the loss of our homes and livelihoods, but also face the impending question of what happens to our people when their lands become uninhabitable. We must consider the fate of countries like Tuvalu, Kiribati, and the Republic of the Marshall Islands. They will have no home to return to. In the face of this unfolding crisis, it becomes crucial to examine whether the traditional definition of a refugee under the Convention is adequate in addressing the complex circumstances arising from climate change. As small islands disappear, the question arises, how will our people be received? I think the question was just posed. Will the international community recognize them as refugees? You're probably familiar with the case of Mr. Teituata of Kiribati, where he filed a case with the UN Human Rights Council and through the New Zealand court system to remain in New Zealand. He argued that the rising sea level and other effects of climate change had rendered his country, Kiribati, uninhabitable for all its residents. While his complaint was not successful, we think that the ruling sets forth new standards that could facilitate the success of future climate change-related asylum claims. It's the first decision by a UN Human Rights Treaty body on a complaint by an individual seeking asylum protection from the effects of climate change. While the international legal framework provides essential protection to those fleeing persecution, it is necessary to reassess and expand this framework to accommodate the unique challenges posed by climate-induced displacement. The plight of small island developing states calls for a comprehensive approach that takes into account the specific vulnerabilities and needs of these nations, of our nations. It is our collective responsibility as global citizens to ensure that the international community responds compassionately and effectively to the plight of those affected by climate change-induced displacement. This requires us to explore new avenues and engage in meaningful dialogue to develop a suitable legal framework that addresses the evolving nature of refugee status in the context of climate change. Efforts to address the impacts of climate change on the displacement of people include Tuvalu's own initiative to embrace digital technologies and transitioning to the virtual realm, offers of land for relocation, some form of quota system. I must make mention that while small Pacific Island nations face the existential threat due to the impacts of climate change, other small island nations in the Pacific, such as Nauru, are contributing to host temporary arrangements through offshore camps and refugee settlement for asylum seekers from around the world. We must invest in sustainable development initiatives and climate adaptation strategies to mitigate the impacts of climate change and protect the rights and well-being of affected communities. By fostering international cooperation and partnerships, we can support small island developing states and their people in building resilient and sustainable futures. To conclude, very short, the evolution of the concept of a refugee is undoubtedly underway, and we must acknowledge that the traditional definition does not fully capture the complexities of climate-induced displacement. Small island developing states face unique challenges as they grapple with the loss of their lands. It is imperative that we come together as an international community to develop inclusive and forward-thinking policies that address the needs of those affected by climate change. I am pleased to note that the International Organization of Migration has a strategy for the Pacific, which includes climate change and human mobility as one of its 3 key pillars. We need to work hand in hand to ensure a future where no one is left behind and where the inherent dignity and rights of all individuals are held. We have a divine calling to enable human beings to find a home and make foreigners part of the community. Echoing Mandela's unwavering support for human rights, I would also like to end by quoting one of my favorites from the Book of Hebrews, which refers to refugees and people and how we should consider it to guide international policy making in this matter. Keep on loving one another as brothers and sisters. Do not forget to show hospitality to strangers, for by so doing, some people have shown the hospitality to angels without knowing. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, for your words, but also for the images that you showed today, making the reality very vivid to all of us. And thank you also for speaking to the challenges for your call for an evolution in the global international law system, an evolution that recognizes the challenges faced by people who are forced to flee because of the impact of climate change. And somehow today's conversation is very fitted. And the panel that you have with the Assistant High Commissioner for Protection of UNHCR speaking to the continued relevance of this 17 years old international instrument, what it has given us as a world in terms of our ability to protect and to assist people forced to flee, but also recognizing that the Refugee Convention and our common global refugee system is confronted with serious challenges, challenges that have to do with the various practices of states, the sheer growth in the number of people seeking safety, the reality of the difficulty in finding solution for people who've been displaced, whether recently or in very many protracted situations across the world, but also speaking to the challenges of climate change and what it represents for our world. And of course, the ambassador, through her remarks, also reminded us of this need for an evolution. And now is the time to hear from you in terms of questions that you may have, ideas that this presentation may have sparked. And I think you have the privilege of having, I would argue, the most fitted and appropriate panel for this conversation with each one of you. So now the floor is yours. we have about 30 minutes of question and answers. I will first take about 3 to 5 questions, and then I will revert back for our panel to share some words of wisdom with all of you. So please, the floor is yours. I don't know whether we have a microphone rolling in the room. Okay, great. I will ask each one of you would like to take the floor to kindly introduce yourself. Say which country, university you are from, and then please go ahead with your comments or your questions.
Maybe not university, just country.
Country?
Yeah, just country.
Okay, very good. So I've been instructed to only ask about countries. And so then please, yeah, I see the gentleman there. Yes, here, please. And then there was a hand also in front. I think it was.
I think it's on. Thank you very much.
Yes, it is on.
I'm one of the coaches of the University of Moot Service in Hungary. I was very delighted to hear both presentations and contributions, which were insightful and valuable at the same time. So, if I might have a bundle package of 2 very short questions, to divide it as one, I would like to ask the Madam Ambassador of what you see regarding movements, because as you have alluded to, this several times, the current refugee definition is a bit out of date. And from my point of view, I think you have 3 options. You can amend the 1951 convention, you can have a new convention, or you can look for these alternative remedies. And this is what the international community is leaning towards. Do you see a commitment, a true, genuine legal commitment from states to amend the legal situation? We have many fellow ambassadors who would like to move towards having a stronger obligation for the protection of refugees. Assistant High Commissioner, you have briefly looked into the new Nansen Pass and the sort of 2.0 version of this very bold initiative. Could you please elaborate on this matter of, is this in a stage of development? Is this underway? Is this a project that will be realized shortly? Or if there's anything else we can learn from this? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Any further yes, right here and then your next. FIFA.
Thank you. Actually, the question is, anyone wants to answer it. Do you think the implications of new technologies are being considered in developing strategies for aiding refugees? Because sometimes refugees are required, or asylum seekers are required to fill in online formulars and submit online documents online. Even it's hard sometimes to have access to internet, whether it might be in caps or another. Do you think this is being considered for the development of strategies? Thank you.
Can you introduce yourself?
Sorry. I am from Mexico.
Mexico. Okay. Great. Then we have one more minute. You may want to stand up so they can see you. All right.
It's a passion to hear you say. My question relates more to UNHCR's role. And I was wondering whether UNHCR has been considering making a presentation before the International Court of Justice for the upcoming advisory opinion on climate change regarding the scope of refugee protection within existing treaty and customary law in order to extend existing already norms and make them apply to protect climate refugees.
Thank you. Okay, then any further comment right here in front?
Good evening. My question is an extension to the question that has been asked regarding climate situations and the refugees in the context of refugees. My name is Shagun Kanotia and I'm from India. My question is that since the whole scope of climate change has, like the states basically evade responsibility, claiming that in international law it has an ambiguous application. My question is regarding the future of climate change, refugees who are fleeing from climate change context, and how do they still receive protection under international law, since it still has the application of international law is not wide enough to accommodate such refugees.
Great. Thank you very much for your questions. And okay, I don't see any further hands, so we will now be turning to our panelists. I will, of course, ask the ambassador to start with the questions that were referred to her and any further comment that you would like to make, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Lovely question from my brother from Hungary. On the three options for men, make a new or consider an alternative remedy. I have not had the opportunity to speak to colleague ambassadors, but which is something that I will now take on board. But just from my own perspective and view, there is an existing convention that does not is not fit for purposes the word that I use that I heard this evening. And when something is not fit for purpose, we should walk towards the move to amend or change. So I think we will be guided by the advice of our legal minds on which option best responds to the challenges that are faced by the world, in particular, or the Pacific can consider which option would best address the challenges that climate change is bringing about to the countries of the Pacific. A very quick response, or an easy response to the question from Mexico on the use of technology. By all means, we should be able to, we should facilitate in all aspects of the process of refugees. We should employ the use of technology to facilitate that. So if it hasn't been done so, we should reach progress. And the example that I spoke to, not necessarily on refugees, but Tuvalu, already looking and employing the concept Tuvalu will exist in the virtual realm. It's not amazing. Maybe daunting. That's the idea. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Tina. And I was very pleased that you mentioned the Kiribati decision, because it's one of the highest level views of the Human Rights Committee that at least acknowledges that while on the facts of the case that failed, it was nonetheless one where the court was prepared to concede that the court committee would be very going to see in the future case an example where somebody fleeing their island in the Pacific, in this case, would need the protection of the Refugee Convention. So we'll see. I would like to comment that I think one of the greatest, but many people have mentioned to me that the possibility of the new protocol to the Refugee Convention for amendment would technically be possible, or an entirely new agreement. I can see why one would ask that question, but I'm afraid my personal view is that the political environment globally is so difficult at the moment that the chances of getting an amendment or a protocol or even a new treaty on this subject are very small indeed. I regret that, but I think we have to be realistic, and the question of where one puts energy. It might be that it would be helpful to start looking at some drafts, see how this law could evolve, And at the moment, the greatest risk of opening up the current refugee convention is that we would lose the support that we've had for it historically. There would be a risk, and we need to analyse and think about this before we move to support for a protocol. But things change, and can change rapidly, and the horror over the impact of climate change and growing understanding what's happening in the Pacific and other parts of the world may very well create a political will that would look at a project. So never say that, but I think at the moment it would be an exceptionally difficult thing to achieve. But as I said, lawyers and policymakers and environmentalists, why not draft what we think might look like and see where it goes over the coming years, because there will be, I think, a different approach to the impacts of climate change, and it may very well envisage some sort of new agreement. Otherwise, it's going to be an adaptation, it's going to be managing the burden, it will be damage, loss, which you know has been considered by the climate. So that's fascinating. The Nelson passport, thank you for the question. It's a serious proposal for us. We are rather hoping that we'll actually get some pledges at the Global Refugee Forum in December that will promote the idea of the Nansen. We're using the name Nansen because people know it. It could be anything else, but basically a document that's recognised by governments. And that's where we will come back to our ambassadors in the diplomatic world to see whether we could get enough engagement with the idea of an Nansen passport, because the key point is it has to be recognised. Otherwise, it has no value at all. I think it's an idea worth exploring, just like your first question. On technology, yes, it's fascinating what's happening with the use of technology, partly driven by COVID. Because the refugees wanted access at the border or was to make a claim for asylum. And they were able to do so by a number of countries where they developed the technology to allow them to submit their documents digitally. Examples of interviews being conducted virtually. And we can see huge potential for allowing access. A very interesting example is the United States, that's now looking at an app, was developed an app for making an application outside the United States, partly to avoid dangerous journeys, the trafficking and the abuse of women, all that happens on movements. If you could do it wherever you're safe with an instant connection, you could actually make an application, and that might be then that will give you an appointment eventually at an appropriate place where your claim could be considered. Now, that's a big step forward, and there'll be many, many others. So one other thing with UNHCR is self-registration, so that an applicant for refugee status could manage almost all of their application and processes through an account, which would enable them to communicate with us. We would respond, fill out the relevant, provide the relevant information, and to get the process started. So we actually see this as the future. It's going to be technology. And also, it's wonderful in terms of imparting information, making sure people know that they may have a refugee claim, or that really they should perhaps look at migrant applications to look at migrant pathways or labour pathways. So the technology can provide everybody with access, except, and I think your question alluded to this, those who haven't got the technology are in rural areas without internet connections. That's something we're going to clearly have to work on, because otherwise it's meaningless. Many of the people we deal with are in remote areas, and we have to be careful about that. But I've been a little cautious about this myself and thought, well, refugees are usually have very few resources. How are they ever going to use it? But in the last few weeks, we've already seen the use of technological applications for refugee status in the United States in the thousands in Mexico. We think those numbers are going to massively increase. So the challenge is going to be how the United States responds to these new technological capacities. So that's a very bright so discussing the numbers. I'm going to pass to my colleague, who's our senior legal advisor, to tell us a little bit about the opportunities to bring an ethics brief to the International Court of Justice. I should introduce Manuel Gali. Commissioner, thank you. And it's been really inspiring to hear important messages and issues about UNHCR actively takes place in court proceedings and courts around the world. Scopes to say, as a friend of the court or a magisterial. And we've done that through a number of regional courts over time. And we are certainly ready to look at any opportunity we can do so. We believe the full courts to address questions of international law relevant to our mandate. Our mandate provides for us to give guidance to states on the scope of international refugee law instruments. And we seek to contribute to discussions within ways we can hopefully develop the law and understanding of refugee law, international law more broadly, and safety to refugees. The ICJ opinion that's been asked is a very broad resolution. The scope of the resolution calls for clarification of the extent of states' obligations with regards to the effects of their activities on the environment. And there is a specific reference to this refugee law per se. But we're going to examine the question carefully and see if there might be scope of areas of useful contribution that could make to that discussion. We have also seen in a number of other courts around the world that these issues are arising. We've held referral courts to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights over recent times, seeking an opinion on the climate change issue, which has specifically included a reference to displacement. The UNHCR has in fact been asked to consider submitting advice already. So we'll look carefully at these issues and indeed see what we can bring to bear with reference to the way in which these legal principles have been applied in a range of situations. What we do seek to do also beyond court proceedings is to contribute to international legislation more broadly on ways in which protection for the rights of people affected by the adverse impacts of climate change and disaster can be more clearly guaranteed. And this includes discussions in the UNFCCC's also international mechanism task force on displacement, also discussions in the context of on disaster displacement, state body which was to convene specifically to look at these questions. And here we're talking to states and to many other stakeholders about the potential for more effective use of existing international instruments. In addition to developing them, including through referrals and appeals of courts, we see enormous scope for better use of international treaties that are there already. This is the High Commissioner referring to the fact that we do see many situations in which people were displaced in the context of climate change and disaster would fall within the definition of a refugee in situations in which conflict or violence is either triggered or exacerbated by the effects of climate change, in contexts where minorities may be denied access to humanitarian assistance or marginalized or further discriminated against, in contexts where limited resources are available to help people to mitigate or to address the effects of climate change, in contexts where climate activists are seen to come in direct conflict with the political views of parties in this. So there are many situations in which we believe that much can be done to promote better use of existing law in ways which can also deal with some of the reluctance, the hesitation that states will have about moving swiftly to new instruments and to further expand the scope of binding legal effects.
Thank you very much to our two panelists and to Madeline Gall for the additional elements of analysis of insights into the issues that bring us here today. I'm just looking at the room to see if we have any further hints. As I don't see, then I will take two final comments and then we will end there if there is any more. So I see one person here. So then you will have the final comment and then we will hear concluding remarks from our panelists and then we will end the session.
Hello, good evening. Thank you for your speeches. It was really nice meeting you. It's not actually a question. Oh, my name is Balwa from Brazil. And it's not really a question, it's more of a clarification because I was very curious about one of the pictures that the beautiful lady with the flower in her hair that you presented to us. I don't know if you have the slides still, because in one of the pictures appeared a man. I think it was in water. If I'm not mistaken, water to his knee. Yes, yes, exactly. So if you could give us the context of the picture.
This picture is like.
So then maybe as the ambassador is about to respond to this question about context and indication about the photo, I will also kindly ask the ambassador for any concluding remarks that you would like to make before I turn to Assistant High Commissioner Tweets also for her concluding remarks. So Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I think that photo is from Tuvalu. Then Tuvalu with their campaign, global campaign to inform the world about their crisis. Yes. So we took this photo from the catalog of Tuvalu photos, which they have used in their campaigns. I don't know the context that's taken, but they've gone to this level to showcase and to visualize the reality about what I have been to Tuvalu, and it's my go-to country in the Pacific. Even within the Pacific, it's difficult to go around the Pacific because of flights and challenges to do that. But I can certainly connect with my colleagues in Tuvalu to provide you some more context of that photograph. I guess as a concluding remarks, I just want to share that or re-emphasize one of the civic priorities is climate change. Our leaders have endorsed it as the single most challenging threat to the existence of some of our countries in the region. And that priority has been seen across all sectors of our economies, and to see the impact of climate change. And of course, it all comes down to the existence of people. What is the impact of climate change on people? We must ensure that international policies respond to that threat. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you, Patrick. I'm going to perhaps finish by noting that the norms of international law that underpin human rights and underpin refugee law and obligations to people who need international protection are really under threat today in a way that I don't think has been true for the last 70 or so years of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. We live in a political environment where these normative provisions are being threatened by in the political environment, through social media, through populist politics. And it's a challenge to stand up for the fundamental rights of access to make a claim for asylum, and of course the principles of non-refoulement. No one must be returned to a place of persecution and violence. And I think that's the challenge of OSS for your generation. When I studied law, which was the early 60s, rather a year or two ago, we all sort of rather the law, and you respected the law, and that included international law. But it's very different for your generation. You're dealing in an environment where people are actually challenging the normative basis of these laws and arguing that these treaties are very 19th or 20th century, not 20th century. So what relevance do they have for today, and can they be made to work? I'd say, of course, that they have great relevance. The means of implementation have been failing. And that's where we need to be pragmatic and principled in trying to understand why these laws work. So I won't give you a lecture. I would like to say that climate is, of course, a huge challenge, and we're all aware of it. We're seeing the human responses, and it's been wonderful to have the ambassador with us. But I'd like to just emphasize the point about conflict. It really is conflict that is driving the overwhelming majority of people in the most horrific of circumstances. And just to give you an indication of the work we do at UNHCR, and we've of course been concerned about Ukraine, then Sudan, then Iraq. But now, of course, it's what's happening in Tunisia and now on the borders of Burkina Faso and Mali. So what I'm saying is that we need to work very seriously on ensuring respect for the rule of law in international affairs. Find some way of making these laws relevant to the kinds of conflicts that are fueling the very high numbers of people that we're seeing in international protection. So good luck with the new people and may this team win.
Trying to prevent you from going home, but I must be remiss of me if I don't do justice to the photograph on the screen. This is the Honorable Simon Coffey, the Toronto Foreign Minister. He filmed his statement to address the COP26 summit, and he filmed it needed to showcase or let the world know the implications of sea level rise into our city. So I thank you for that opportunity.
Thank you. So please join me in a round of applause to thank.
Yeah, thank you so very much, Ms. Triggs, Ambassador Levi, for your comments, for the lecture, for the information, and also really for engaging with all of us here this evening. These very important matters. I would like to give closing remarks, but not on my behalf, but on behalf of our Assistant Director, Mr. Lloyd Coupet, who unfortunately could not make it to Geneva this year. We hope that he will be online with us, but we seem to be limited by the technology of our time. So I will be giving you his remarks. So, quote, ambassadors, United Nations staff, law faculty, coaches, friends, colleagues, all protocols observed. On behalf of the Center for Human Rights at the University of Pretoria, I would like to thank our friends and partners at the South African Permanent Mission, the Swiss Embassy, and all other donors who have contributed so greatly towards the realization of this competition. I would also like to thank Dr. Patrick Ebba and the Geneva team for the vision, the support, and partnership in making this year's Human Rights Lecture and Moot Court competition a success. I would also like to thank the entire center team of the Center for Human Rights, who have been on the ground supporting the competition and supporting that everything runs smoothly. A special word of thanks goes to Mr. Eric Testonet, Chief Human Rights Council Branch, Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, for every year making the Nelson Mandela Moot Court flawlessly and facilitating all our logistical endeavors, travel, visa registrations, and so forth. Thank you also for gracing us with your presence at this fourth Nelson Mandela Human Rights Lecture. We always encouraging the vanguard of human rights advocates being developed annually at the global level. Indeed, we will forever be indebted to the UN Human Rights Council and Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights for their unwavering support, generosity, and hospitality. We are delighted as the Center for Human Rights to have His Excellency Ambassador Václav Havel, President of the United Nations Human Rights Council, with us today. Thank you for availing the UN premises, honoring our invitation, and making this day so special by setting the scene and giving excellent opening remarks that will inspire the young human rights advocates from all over the world who are participating in this year's Nelson Mandela Moot Court competition. Over the years, we have always partnered and enjoyed the support of the South African High Commission to Geneva. We appreciate this continued partnership, especially the material support that has been availed for the Nelson Mandela Human Rights Lecture Series. In this vein, I would like to thank His Excellency Ambassador Nkosi, the permanent representative of South Africa to the United Nations at Geneva, for making the time to be with us today and showing your solidarity and support for this lecture. The Commonwealth Secretariat has always been forthcoming in supporting the Nelson Mandela Moot competition and human rights lecture in many ways. We thank you for the material, moral, and intellectual support making these important events a reality every year. A lecture of this high level will not be successful without the right speakers. It was critical to have speakers who are experts in the issue up for discussion or who have lived experience for the matter. In this regard, I would like to thank Ms. Gillian Triggs, Assistant High Commissioner for Protection in the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. Thank you so much for enriching the lecture with your expertise and excellent insights. It was also important to hear from an ambassador from one of the islands at risk of climate change. Like many Pacific Island countries, Samoa is continually at risk of natural disasters, particularly with ever-increasing impact of climate change, bringing more frequent and severe cyclones, floods, and rising sea levels. Besides armed conflict and instability, the climate crisis has further exacerbated the current refugee crisis, with the UNHCR estimating that there are now over 100 million refugees globally. We are therefore grateful for Ambassador Nella Pepetavita-Leve, permanent representative of Samoa to the United Nations at Geneva. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences as a representative of an island nation at risk of climate change impacts. The hospitality, support, and partnership of the Swiss government and the various embassies around in Geneva is highly appreciated. Every year, the Swiss government and the various embassies have supported us materially with processing visas and ensuring that we conduct the Nelson Mandela Moot competition and human rights lecture in a peaceful environment. We thank you. Finally, I would like to thank our audience today for attending the fourth Mandela Human Rights Lecture. I know that most of you are busy focusing on your submissions in the Moot competition, but I have no doubt that you have found this high-level human rights lecture beneficial and enriching. I would also like to thank those who have been following the lecture and deliberations virtually. Let me end my remarks with two quotes from our icon, Nelson Mandela. As he gave his insights on the refugee crisis, he stated as follows, quote within a quote, It is easy to break down and destroy. The heroes are those who make peace and build. Source, 6th Nelson Mandela Lecture, Walter Sisulu Gardens, 12th July, 2008. Quote, those who live in exile as refugees have for long been sustained by their hope for an end to the conflict and the dawning of a better future. International Day of Solidarity, the people of Palestine, 25th November, 1998. End quote. Open quote, start quote. It is true that armed conflicts and political instability around the world have been the biggest causes of the influx of refugees in search for peace and stability and better life. The people who wage war and cause this destruction must drop their deadly weapons and pursue peace and reconstruction. The millions of refugees around the world often find themselves in precarious situations with inadequate access to food, health, and shelter after they have been forcibly displaced by armed conflict or political persecution. They deserve protection, compassion, empathy, and solidarity from all of us. They deserve protection. The refugees are not burdens, but human beings who find themselves in foreign lands through no fault of their own. We therefore call on all governments, intergovernmental bodies, UNHCR, IOM, NGOs, and academia to find lasting solutions to conflict and climate change and provide protection and livelihoods to refugees around the world. Their challenges are our collective responsibility. Thank you and enjoy the beverages and the food that have been prepared for you. End quote. Thank you again so very much to our speakers, to you, dear audiences. And we have some gifts for you, Ambassador Mistress, which my great colleague Carol will perhaps hand over, if possible. Since we are the Center for Human Rights, we are an academic institution, what better gift than a book? And, I think the names, there we go. Carol, let's just check the names. Are they? Oh, wonderful. So thank you again. And I would like to invite you for some refreshments. Oh, there's one more thing. I'm sorry. There's the announcements. Oh, thank you.